Welcome to DogTalk360 Ask a Vet podcast. In collaboration with the George Animal Hospital, our main aim of these educational sessions are the wellness of your dog, and we will cover a variety of relevant topics applicable to all dog breeds, ranging from habits and behaviors, fitness and exercise, vaccinations and parasite control, to chronic disease and other chronic conditions.
Hello everybody, I am your host Dr. Christian Blighnout from the George Animal Hospital, and today we will be discussing deworming. But before we get to our topic, let's just talk about something in regards to the website quickly. On the Protection Canine Training website, you'll see there's a section where you can submit questions for us to answer. There's also a little token or button on the right hand side of your screen that will guide you to this section and help you to submit questions or topics for us to discuss on our podcast episodes, or questions that I can email you back on. So please make use of this and make it nice and interactive. Alright, but today we are talking about deworming. Right, so we are following up on our vaccination topic of last time, and the reason why we're putting these two together is these two treatments or controls are actually most of the time done together to make it simpler for owners and for the vet. So the four questions that we're going to discuss today, or the headings, would be: why deworm? Signs of worms in your dog, classification of these worms, and fourthly, when to deworm. So, first of all, why deworming? I think this is quite straightforward, but there's one or two things that people might not be aware of, so we'll go through them quickly. The obvious reason is that you want your pet to be parasite-free. Worms or internal parasites suck the nutrients or the blood from your animal's intestines, and this can cause some health risks or just debilitate your pet from nutrients that their bodies need. So in general, it is good to have your animal parasite free. Now, the more I would say severe or more important things to also consider is, especially in younger dogs or smaller pets, there's a life-threatening consequence to having a parasite infestation in these small animals. They can be so debilitated that they become anemic, they lose a lot of blood, they lose a lot of nutrients, which can drive them to the point of being hospitalized, going into shock, and even death. So to avoid this, you need to start vaccinating your puppies at an early age. And then the last thing is also that worms are zoonotic, so basically it's something that can spread between animals and humans. And especially if you've got toddlers in your home, you don't want them to be exposed to the worms or the parasites that your pet carries. Then the second thing is, what are the signs of worms in your pet? And this is quite important to notice. One thing that you'll probably see, and people are quite aware of this sign, is scooting or scratching their bums on the carpet or the grass. I must put in a side note here that this can also commonly be a question of full anal glands. So it's not necessarily a sign of worms. It could be your dog's anal glands that are also troubling your pet. So it's something to have a look at. Don't just accept that it is worms. But yes, scratching of the butt, definitely a cause or sign actually. Then losing weight despite having a healthy appetite. If your animal's eating a lot but still losing weight or not gaining, internal parasites could be playing a role. A pot-bellied appearance or a hanging belly. This is a phenomenon that we call ascites, which is basically fluid inside the abdomen. I'm not going to go into detail as to why this happens, But if there is a severe worm infestation in the animal, fluid collects in the abdomen and can create this pot-bellied appearance, and you often see it with an emaciated dog in a big pot belly. Then another thing that we should mention is a poor or dull hair coat. Unfortunately, this is a very vague sign because it's also a sign or symptom of other conditions. It's just a sign that there's a general health issue, but it can definitely be seen with parasite issues. Worms in the feces or around the anus is another thing that you should look out for. So I always tell people to regularly check your animal's poo. If it's on the grass, flush it with the hose pipe, and you will see the worm sometimes in bad cases. The appearance of spaghetti or rice kernels, something that you might notice, or even small rice kernel or rice grain appearance around the anus, sticking in the hair, you can also sometimes notice. Then in more severe cases, you will see vomiting sometimes and diarrhea. So basically gastrointestinal signs. So if your dog has a gastro, worms might be a cause, or actually worms might be contributing to that problem. Then lethargy, fever even. These are signs that you'll see when an animal is becoming really sick and affected by worms. But again, these are signs that you'll see with other diseases as well. And as it progresses and gets worse, like I mentioned earlier, especially with pups or smaller dogs, they can get severely ill and debilitated. They can even go into a coma if left unattained. And these animals, if they're really sick, they need to get to the hospital to get proper treatment, fluids mainly, and some glucose supplementation to get them back to their best again. That is more or less the signs that you'll see with worm issues. The classification of these worms, this is something that I'm not going to go into too much detail in. The reason we're discussing this is just so that you are aware of the fact that there are a bunch of different classes of worms, so that when you pick your dewormer for your pet, that you make sure that you're getting a dewormer that covers them for most of the common worms. Because you can get dewormer from a supermarket and not always just from the vet, make sure that the dewormer includes more than one classification of worm. I still advise that it's best to buy it from a vet, but with this knowledge you might be able to pick a right product from any distributor. So basically what you have to look for is that you want your dog to be covered for both roundworms and tapeworms. There's a third class, the lungworms, which is something that we don't see often in our area, but this is a worm that can be spread by slugs and snails. It gets into the blood vessels and into the lungs of animals, but that is not so common. What we want to focus on is your roundworms and your tapeworms. Roundworms have a spaghetti-like appearance. You get different types, and they can be quite long, they can be small, but generally it's a round spaghetti or noodle looking like a noodle type of worm. And this is something that puppies can get from their mother's milk. Dogs pick it up from rodents or in the soil environment. And then the other class, tapeworms, they have a grain of rice appearance, or a flat worm that has different segments, and these segments almost resemble grains of rice. And these worms, they pick up from fleas, from carcasses of rodents, rabbits and other animals that they eat, and also then from the environment, and mainly also from the poo of other dogs. So those are your two most important classifications. So always when you buy a deworming product, check that it covers both roundworms and tapeworms. Otherwise, your animal will only be partially covered for worms. And remember, just a side note, but something that I've picked up quite often is people are confused by deworming and tick and flea control. These are different products, guys. Your tick and flea control products is normally a tablet or a spot on that you put on the skin, and these don't normally cover your animal for worms. There are one or two products that does, but you'll have to ask when buying the product if it does include a dewormer, because more often than not, it's not including a dewormer. Mostly dewormers come as a solitary tablet that you'll have to administer with your tick and flea treatment to make sure that your animal is free from internal and external parasites. So just make a note of that and make sure to always check. And then lastly, when are you supposed to deworm your pet? Now this is something that can vary because it depends on the environment your animal is in. I generally deworm pets every time that they come in for vaccination and when they come in with gastrointestinal issues. It's important for an owner, as a rule of thumb, to maybe deworm your pets 3 times or 4 times a year. Now the environment also plays a role in this decision. So if you have an animal that's outdoors a lot, especially farm animals, dogs that like to dig or hunt or scavenge, then deworming more often would be advised. So then I'd say at least 3 times a year. And also if you have smaller kids that are exposed to the dogs, to make sure your dogs are parasite free is quite important. And then with indoor dogs, lap dogs, dogs that never come out in the environment too often, these dogs you can maybe deworm a little bit less. And it's important to not over deworm. It's not going to necessarily be detrimental to your dog, but worm resistance is something that we don't want to create in our pets. We are already seeing this with farm animals, and if we are going to over treat for worms in dogs and cats, we might get to the point where our drugs won't work for these worms anymore, because the worms have been exposed to it so often so that they have created a resistance in these parasites. So also be aware of that. So don't do it too much. So yeah, basically that is what I would say is most important to when you should deworm. If you are unsure if you need to deworm, or you want to check if your dog has worms, it's advised to submit a stool sample to your veterinarian. The vet can then do a fecal float or a fecal smear and check if there is worm eggs in the stool, and by this they can actually decide, does your dog have parasites and is it needed to treat at that stage. So if you're unsure, it's always easy. Just submit a stool sample to your veterinarian. They can check if your dog is infected or not. And then just lastly, a few side effects that you might notice. Sometimes after giving your dewormer to a pet, there might be a bout of nausea or some vomiting and some diarrhea sometimes. But they're not often seen, but something to take note of. In really bad cases where a pet has been carrying a large load of or a heavy burden of worms, especially in puppies and smaller dogs, deworming can actually have quite a detrimental effect. So if your dog was sick because of worms, you need to have them dewormed, but then there's unfortunately a bit of a backlash in some cases where the dying worms exposes the raw gut, because they were attached to the gut and now they fall off. There might be some raw gut exposed, and the dead worms in the intestine of the pet is now also a source of protein to bacteria. So bacteria that feeds on these proteins can also have access to the damaged gut and then have a gastroenteritis as an after effect. So this is something just to take note of. So if your dog has had a bad worm infestation and they are treated for internal parasites, you might have to check and see if they're okay afterwards. Otherwise, get him to your vet as soon as possible. But yeah, in general, deworming, very important for all your pets, just as a general health measure. In extreme cases, it can be more than that, but it's just basically for general health, and it's quite important in all pets. No dogs, and this is my final conclusion that I want to send you home with, no dogs are free of worms. Every dog at some stage of its life, more often than not, will be exposed to worms. So deworming is important for all pets. Right, I think that is it for today. If you have any further questions, please submit them, and please tune in to our next episode, which will be released within the next week or two, and that episode will be about dental care, and it's something that's also very important to all pets, so make sure not to miss that. And I hope to hear from you soon. Have a nice day.
For more information, visit our websites dogtalk360.co.za and georgevet.co.za. Also follow and subscribe to our social media platforms for DogTalk360 and George Animal Hospital. DogTalk360. Best advice, best training, better dogs.